The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass as Rachel Torres clocked in at 6:24 a.m., her badge cold against her collarbone. The float pool assignment board showed trauma surgery, the unit nobody wanted, the shifts that ground nurses down to nothing. Perfect. She preferred it that way. Invisibility had kept her alive in Ramadi. It would keep her alive here too. Cedar Creek Medical smelled like every hospital she'd ever worked, antiseptic layered over stale coffee, underneath it all the metallic tang of blood and fear. The surgical ward was already moving at its own brutal rhythm, ventilators wheezed their mechanical songs, monitors beeped their steady accusations, and somewhere down the corridor someone was dying and someone else was trying to stop it. Rachel moved through the hallways like a shadow, nodding once to nurses she'd never met, pulling on fresh gloves without making eye contact. The scars on her hands caught the harsh white light, old silver lines that disappeared back into her sleeves. Nobody asked about them. Nobody ever did. The charge nurse, a woman named Diane with purple scrubs and exhaustion written across her face, handed Rachel a 3-ring binder without looking up. "You've got 4 patients today. Room for 12 is post-op from a liver resection, watch his drain output, Mercer gets weird about anything over 50 milliliters per shift. Room for 14 is stable, just needs vitals every 2 hours. Room for 18. Diane paused, her voice dropping slightly. "That one's special. You monitor him, you don't chat with him, you don't answer questions about his condition. Security's been briefed. You'll get a phone call at some point during your shift. Just answer it. Don't tell anyone about it." Rachel nodded once. This was the assignment she'd been waiting for. The Pentagon had placed her here 6 weeks ago under her civilian credentials, Rachel Torres, RN, no military affiliation listed, no prestigious nursing school on her resume, just a woman who showed up to work and did her job quietly. The patient in 418 was why she was here. Intelligence suspected something moving through Cedar Creek's network. Someone was selling classified medical data, and the patient in that room, a congressman's chief of staff with connections to the Joint Chiefs, was bait. Rachel's job was to watch, monitor, report. She moved through her first 3 patients with the kind of efficiency that came from habit and training. For lines checked. Medications verified. Dressings changed without wasting motion. Her hands moved like they were reading Braille, fingers finding problems before her eyes caught them. The post-op liver resection patient had a drain that was draining slightly more than it should, amber fluid pooling faster than Mercer's orders seemed to anticipate. She made a note on the chart and moved on. Room for 18 was a corner unit with double doors and a security camera mounted where nobody could miss it. The man inside was in his 60s, recovering from a routine prostate procedure that was never just routine. Rachel checked his vitals without speaking. BP 138/82. Steady. Good. She was adjusting his foredrip when her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number, status on the patient. She replied, stable. All parameters normal. The response came back in seconds, stay sharp. She pocketed the phone and moved back into the hallway. That was when she heard the voice, smooth as expensive scotch, sharp as a surgical blade, cutting through the morning like he owned the air it traveled through. "Who's the float from the pool?" Dr. Gerald Mercer materialized beside Diane at the nurse's station like he'd been conjured by his own arrogance. He was the kind of tall that involved a tailor, navy scrubs fitted so precisely they might have been custom-made, a face like someone had carved it to look perpetually unimpressed, and the kind of watch that cost more than Rachel made in a month. Chief of Surgery. 7 years at Cedar Creek. 3 published papers on surgical outcomes. A reputation that preceded him like cologne. Rachel Torres, Diane said, not meeting his eyes. Float pool, started on the unit 3 days ago. Where did she train? Mercer's eyes moved across the unit, not bothering to look at Rachel directly. Community college nursing program in Jacksonville. She's got her credentials, she's solid. Community college. He said it the way someone might say, public restroom. Not Johns Hopkins? Not Emory. Different pathway, Rachel said quietly. She was at the med cart now, pulling medications for her next round. Same license. Mercer turned then, and his gaze found her with the precision of a targeting laser. He was older than she'd expected from his reputation, maybe 55, maybe more, the kind of aging that came from a diet of resentment and scotch. His eyes were pale blue, the color of ice water. Same license, different preparation. There's a difference between checking boxes and understanding surgical principles. He smiled at his own joke, and Diane flinched slightly. What sponsor recommended you for Cedar Creek, Ms. Torres? No sponsor. Rachel didn't look up from the medication cabinet. Applied through the agency. Of course you did. Mercer turned away, already finished with her. Make sure the post-op drains are monitored correctly. I've seen float pool nurses miss things. Costs lives. He was gone before Rachel could respond, his presence leaving the unit feeling slightly smaller, slightly colder. Diane exhaled quietly and touched Rachel's arm in a gesture that might have been apology or might have been pity. Rachel didn't acknowledge it. She just finished pulling medications and continued her rounds, her hand steady as surgical steel, her face showing nothing. The morning shifted into afternoon in that way hospital time does, fast and slow simultaneously. Rachel worked her rooms, checked her vitals, documented her findings. Nobody asked her questions. Nobody asked where she'd gone to school or who knew her or what family connections had paved her way into nursing. She was a ghost, and ghosts don't need references. It was around 2:13 p.m. when she noticed the issue with the post-op patient in 412. The drain output was climbing, higher now, darker, the consistency changing. She ran the numbers in her head like she was doing complex surgery math, drain change plus vital signs plus medication list. The picture didn't fit the order Mercer had written. The antibiotic coverage was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong in a way that could compound over 48 hours into something dangerous. She pulled the chart and found Mercer in the surgical resident lounge, where he was reviewing imaging on a desktop computer with Dr. Ashford, one of the senior residents. The room was narrow, fluorescent lit, smelling like machine heat and the phantom coffee from someone's breakfast 3 hours ago. Dr. Mercer? Rachel's voice was quiet. Professional. Unthreatening. I wanted to clarify the antibiotic order on the 412 post-op. The cephalosporin coverage. The coverage is appropriate, Mercer said without looking at her. The patient's chart shows a penicillin allergy, and the interaction profile suggests. The coverage is appropriate. This time he looked at her, and his eyes had the quality of someone looking at a speaking dog mildly offended by the attempt. I've been performing post-op protocols longer than you've been a nurse, Ms. Torres. I don't need a float pool temp to validate my clinical judgment. Dr. Ashford suddenly found his shoes very interesting. The silence in the room became the kind of silence that gets remembered. Rachel's jaw tightened by maybe a millimeter. Her hands, hanging at her sides, didn't shake. She simply nodded once, the way someone nods when they've received information, and turned to leave. And Ms. Torres. Mercer's voice followed her into the hallway. In the future, if you have concerns about my orders, bring them to the charge nurse. Not directly to me. We have a hierarchy for a reason. Rachel didn't turn around. She just kept walking, her composure locked down tight, the way it had been locked down in Ramadi when the mortars started falling, when there was work to do and no time for anything else. She returned to the room 412 patient and triple-checked the chart. The order was wrong. She knew it with the certainty of someone who'd run field triage for 47 casualties in a schoolhouse in Fallujah. But she documented it, flagged it, and waited. By 3:26 p.m. she was back at the med cart when she heard Diane's sharp intake of breath. The surgical tech, a man named Marcus with forearms like rope and tattoos that disappeared under his scrubs, was watching her pull supplies. He'd been watching her since this morning, she realized. Not threatening. Curious. You ever work combat hospital? His voice was low. Casual, but not casual. Rachel didn't look at him. Muscle memory had taught her to never confirm anything. What makes you ask? I saw the way you placed that midline this morning. That's not how they teach it in civilian programs. That's how you place them when you've got 10 minutes and the power might go out. He was still watching her. Fort Hood? Ballard? Kandahar. She kept her hands moving, drawing up medications with the kind of precision that came from practice and prayer and the kind of training you don't forget even when you want to. Different pathway, she said quietly, echoing Mercer's words back at him. Same license. Marcus smiled slightly and walked away. He didn't ask again, but the look in his eyes said he already knew the answer. He'd probably served somewhere himself. You could always tell, it was in the way you moved, the efficiency of gesture, the way crisis felt like coming home. Rachel clocked out at 7:42 p.m., and as she walked through the parking lot toward her car, she felt the weight of the flag she kept in her locker, Martinez's flag, folded into the smallest possible geometry, tucked into the bottom of her bag where nobody would ask about it. Martinez, who didn't make it out of that Ramadi schoolhouse. Martinez, whose flag she'd been given at a ceremony that had felt more like a funeral, because it was a funeral, because you don't hand someone a flag unless someone is dead. She'd left the military to disappear. Changed her first name legally. Removed her service records from public databases. Became Rachel Torres, the float pool nurse, invisible and small and untouchable. The Pentagon had come to her a year later with an offer: stay buried, but do this one thing. Monitor this patient. Report any irregular visitors or communications. For weeks of work, then back to her civilian life. She was halfway to her car when her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. Mercer made a call at 2:38 p.m. Called someone named Vickers. Short conversation. Need you to listen to the unit gossip. Report what people are saying about you by tomorrow morning. Rachel closed her eyes for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she understood what was about to happen. The mission was just beginning, and everything she'd buried was about to be very, very relevant. She got in her car and drove toward whatever came next. The next morning arrived with the kind of fluorescent brightness that made everything feel cheap and temporary. Rachel sat in the break room on the 3rd floor, a space that smelled of burnt coffee and someone's sad desk lunch from 3 days prior. Her hands wrapped around a mug that read Cedar Creek Medical, where healing happens, in font that was trying too hard. She was alone. She'd been alone for 12 minutes. The doors opened. 4 nurses entered together, moving like a coordinated unit, and Rachel watched them perform the choreography of humiliation without a word being spoken. They saw her. They stopped. They pivoted. 2 of them gathered their lunch containers from the refrigerator, one labeled Sharon, one labeled Kim, and they walked to a table across the room. The other 2 nurses stood at the counter, pretending to search for something in the cabinet above the microwave, though Rachel knew for a fact that cabinet held only expired seasoning packets and a box of herbal tea no one drank. She did not look up from her coffee. She did not acknowledge the subtle shift in the room's pressure. Her shoulders did not tense. Her breathing did not change. She simply sat, the mug resting in both palms, and waited for them to settle into whatever narrative Dr. Mercer had prepared for them. "Did you hear about the correction?" Sharon said to the group, her voice pitched higher than normal, the tone people used when they were performing for an audience. She told Dr. Mercer his antibiotic choice was wrong. In front of a resident. In front of everyone, Kim added, and there was something almost gleeful in it, the satisfaction of being part of a collective judgment. Rachel turned the mug slowly. Steam rose from the coffee in wispy lines that caught the overhead light. She had corrected a 2nd-generation cephalosporin order for a patient with a documented penicillin allergy. Mercer had written it knowing about the allergy. Or he hadn't known, which was worse. Either way, the patient was still breathing. The patient's white blood cell count would not spike because she had moved first. The surgical tech, the one who'd watched her place the midline with hands that knew exactly where they were going, came in through the break room door and stopped mid-stride when he saw the tableau. His name was Marcus. He was maybe 35, with the kind of easy competence that came from having done emergency medicine in places where the power went out mid-procedure and you finished anyway. He looked at Rachel. He looked at the 4 nurses clustered across the room like seagulls that had caught the smell of something bleeding. He made a deliberate choice. He walked to the refrigerator. He opened it. He pulled out a container with his name on it, Marcus, in careful block letters, and he came to sit at Rachel's table. "How's your morning?" he asked, opening his container to reveal rice and grilled chicken that smelled like actual seasoning, like someone had made it at home with intention. "It's quiet," Rachel said. "Yeah. Quiet usually means something's building." He took a bite, chewed slowly, and kept his eyes on his food. It was a gift, what he was doing. It was also the kind of gesture that would mark him as aligned with her, and they both knew it. Dr. Mercer came through pre-op before 6. Seemed agitated. Rachel did not respond. But her hands, she noticed, had become very still. The day moved forward in the way hospitals moved, in surges and lulls, in moments of absolute necessity punctuated by stretches of waiting. Rachel floated through the morning, checking 4 lines, titrating fluids, documenting vitals with the kind of meticulous precision that made her nearly invisible. She was competent without being noticed. She was helpful without being acknowledged. It was exactly how she'd been trained. Then she rounded a corner between the 3rd and 4th floors and saw the bulletin board outside the nursing station. Someone had printed a formal document on hospital letterhead. It was pinned dead center, at eye level, impossible to miss. The title read, "Formal Performance Review, Areas for Improvement." Her name was on it. The document cited the incident from yesterday. It used the language of institutional authority, insubordination and overreach of scope. It noted that she had overstepped her station and suggested that her lack of proper credentials might be contributing to a pattern of inappropriate clinical judgment. The write-up was signed by Dr. Gerald Mercer, Chief of Surgery, Cedar Creek Medical, dated that morning at 5:48 a.m. 5 nurses stood reading it when Rachel approached. One of them, a nurse named Jenna who had been friendly the previous week, turned and looked at her with an expression that had shifted into something harder. Pity mixed with doubt. The worst combination. "I didn't see anything," Jenna said quietly, and she walked away. Rachel reached for the document. She unpinned it carefully. She held it in both hands and read every word with the same steady attention she would have given to a medication label or a patient's chart. Her face showed nothing. Her breathing remained even. She could have been reading a menu. What she wanted to do, in the most distant corner of her mind where the captain still lived, was find Dr. Mercer and explain to him what happened in Ramadi when someone tried to break your composure in front of your soldiers. She wanted to tell him about the insurgent who had laughed at Martinez's body before they found the IED. She wanted to explain what she had done about that, and why. Instead, she folded the document into thirds and held it against her thigh. "Rachel!" The voice came from behind her, Dr. Mercer himself, moving through the hallway with the confidence of a man who had never questioned whether he had the right to take up space. "A moment in for 12, please." Room for 12 held a post-operative patient, a man maybe 60 years old who had undergone a spinal fusion the previous day. His wife sat in the chair beside the bed, knitting something in anxious stitches. The patient's eyes were half closed from pain medication. This was not a private location. This was the opposite of private. This patient received substandard care during morning vitals, Dr. Mercer said, not to her but to the room at large, to the wife particularly, to anyone who might be listening from the hallway. The new float pool nurse seems to believe she understands clinical decision-making better than the physician managing care. The wife's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Rachel looked at the patient's chart, which she had in fact just reviewed. His vitals were stable. His pain was managed. His dressing was clean. The foresight showed no signs of infiltration. Everything was exactly as it should have been. "That's not accurate," Rachel said quietly. "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Mercer said. His voice had taken on the texture of something rehearsed, something he'd planned. This nurse is a temporary assignment. No permanent position, no credential sponsorship, no institutional backing. Just someone who shows up and thinks she knows better than people who've trained for decades. The wife had set down her knitting. She was watching Rachel now with the skepticism of someone who was being given permission to doubt. "Your husband is stable," Rachel said to her directly. "His vitals are normal. His pain is controlled. If there were any concerns, I would tell you. You can ask the nursing supervisor. You can ask anyone on this floor." "And yet," Dr. Mercer said, turning toward the door, "mistakes have a way of accumulating. I'm documenting this interaction. I trust we won't have further issues." He left. Rachel did not follow him. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble or allow anger to flicker across her features. She simply checked the patient's for line again, made sure his call bell was within reach, and told his wife that she would be back to check on him every hour. But what she wanted to do was scream. The day ended. The night shift began. Rachel punched out at 19:33 and walked through the parking garage to her car, a gray Honda that was the kind of vehicle no one ever remembered. She did not go home. She drove instead to the supply closet on the second floor, the one that nobody used because the main supplies were stored on 4. She waited until the hallway was empty. Then she opened the door and stepped inside. The closet was dark except for a single window, reinforced with chicken wire, that looked out onto the street below. It smelled like plastic and cardboard and something medicinal underneath. Rachel closed the door. She locked it from the inside, which was technically not allowed but which nobody would check. She allowed herself to sit on the floor. She allowed her breathing to become a little less even. She reached into her bag, the canvas tote she carried to work, and found the small square of fabric folded so precisely it could have been a measuring tool. It was a flag. A folded triangle that had been presented to her by a chaplain in a chapel that didn't have any stained glass, in a moment that didn't have any words. Martinez's flag. She did not unfold it. She simply held it in her lap and pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving beside her. 3 seconds. She counted them internally. 1, 2, 3. Then she opened her eyes. Her hands had stopped shaking, and she pressed her fingers against the flag's edge, the crisp corner where it had been folded so carefully by someone who made a ritual of it. "I know," she whispered to no one. She breathed. She straightened. She put the flag back in her bag. She stood and unlocked the closet door and stepped back into the hallway like someone who had only ducked away for a moment of privacy, nothing more, nothing to explain. The parking garage was quieter in the evening. Rachel sat in her car for 8 minutes without starting the engine. The seat was cold. The steering wheel was cold. Everything was cold in the way that waiting is cold. And then, from somewhere in the building, a code was called. Not from her unit. Not a code she needed to answer. But the sound of it, the urgent tone that pierced the evening air, made something shift in her chest. Made the trained part of her, the part that had learned to move in the dark, stand at attention. She got out of the car. She walked back toward the building. She had no idea what was about to unfold. The intercom crackled at 2:27 p.m. Code blue. Surgical wing. Post-op recovery. Rachel heard it the same way she'd heard incoming mortar fire in Ramadi, not with her ears first, but with her nervous system, the primitive part of her brain that recognized the sound of things breaking down. She moved before the announcement finished, abandoning the supply cart she'd been restocking, her stride lengthening as she cut through the hallway toward the surgical unit. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made blood look darker than it actually was. Her scrubs whispered against her legs as she walked. Rubber soles on tile. A rhythm. A countdown. When she burst through the surgical wing doors, the scene was already crystallizing into chaos. A post-operative patient, male, mid-50s, maybe 60, lay on the recovery bed with his chest heaving like he was trying to pull oxygen through a collapsed straw. His oxygen saturation monitor screamed. 84. 82. 79. The numbers kept falling like a coin down a well. His skin had taken on that particular shade of blue that meant his body was suffocating from the inside, and his eyes were wide with the specific terror of someone whose lungs had stopped negotiating and started demanding. Dr. Mercer stood at the bedside, frozen. His hands hung at his sides like they belonged to someone else. A nurse was bagging the patient, forcing air into his lungs with a squeezed plastic bulb, but the effort seemed futile. The patient's oxygen saturation wasn't climbing. It was still dropping. 77. 75. The cardiac monitor beeped a rhythm that was climbing too fast, a rhythm that meant the heart was panicking. Rachel didn't think. Muscle memory took over. She moved to the bedside, her eyes tracking the patient's chest, the way it was moving asymmetrically, the left side barely rising while the right side heaved. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung on the left was compressing everything, the heart, the vessels, the right lung. The patient wasn't drowning in fluid. He was drowning in air that had nowhere to go. I need a 14-gauge needle. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The charge nurse didn't move. Dr. Mercer's head snapped up, his eyes finding her like she was an intruder on his stage. This is a post-operative complication. We need to get him to imaging, we need to. He'll be dead before imaging. Rachel's hand was already moving, locating the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She could feel it through her fingertips, the specific geography of bone and cartilage, the space between ribs like the space between bullets. She'd done this before. Not in a recovery room. In a schoolhouse in Ramadi with no anesthesia and a soldier's blood soaking into sand that refused to absorb anymore. Needle. Now. Someone handed it to her. Surgical tech. Marcus, maybe. She didn't look. She was already prepping the skin with her left hand, her right hand holding the needle at a 45-degree angle to the chest wall. The needle slid in with that familiar resistance, skin, then deeper, then the sudden give as it punctured the pleural membrane. Air hissed out. A small sound. Catastrophic relief. The patient gasped. His oxygen saturation jumped. 78. 82. 88. 91. His color started shifting from that suffocation blue back toward something approaching human. His eyes stopped being wild. His breathing steadied. The cardiac monitor's rhythm settled from panic to something that resembled reason. 94. Stable. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the air conditioning unit cycling overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dr. Mercer's face had rearranged itself into something clinical and careful, the way a predator rearranges its features when it realizes it's being watched. His jaw tightened. His eyes flickered across her face, cataloging, calculating. Rachel stepped back from the bed. Her hands were steady. Her breath was even. She'd just performed an emergency needle decompression in the middle of Cedar Creek Medical in front of 6 witnesses, and every single one of them had just watched her make a decision that Dr. Mercer should have made, the decision that saved the patient's life instead of killing him with protocol. She could see the exact moment the wheels started turning behind his eyes. Not gratitude. Not relief. Something colder. Something that looked like recognition of a threat. Get him intubated, Dr. Mercer said quietly. Chest tube, full imaging protocol. He looked at Rachel. His voice was level, almost friendly. Thank you for the assist. That was quick thinking. It wasn't a compliment. It was a threat wearing a compliment's clothes. Rachel nodded once. Of course, doctor. She turned back to the monitor, keeping her hands occupied, her face neutral. She'd learned this in Ramadi too, how to accept a wound and keep moving, how to not show the bleeding until you were alone. But Marcus had seen something. She caught the surgical tech's expression, not quite shock, not quite recognition, but something in between. He was staring at her hands. At the way she'd moved. At the muscle memory that had bypassed her civilian mind and gone straight to the protocol that had been burned into her body in places that didn't exist on most maps. The next words out of Dr. Mercer's mouth came 3 hours later. Rachel was in the break room, pulling a cold coffee from the refrigerator, the one she'd made that morning and never had time to drink, when her phone vibrated. An email notification. Her stomach turned before she even opened it. From Dr. Gerald Mercer, Chief of Surgery. Subject: formal written warning. To Rachel M. Torres, nursing staff. The words on the screen blurred for a half-second before her eyes brought them into focus. Scope of practice violation. Unauthorized procedure. Reckless endangerment. Insubordination. The language was careful, clinical, devastating. He'd framed the save as a crime. He was calling her heroism a felony. She read it through twice. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw tightened, a muscle flexing below her left ear, but that was all. She closed the email and set the phone on the counter next to the cold coffee. A nurse she'd worked with last week walked in. Saw her. Hesitated. Then turned around and walked back out. But that wasn't the worst part. By 4:19 p.m., that email was printed and posted on the unit bulletin board next to the staff schedule and the patient satisfaction survey results. Anyone entering the surgical wing would see Rachel Torres's name, her alleged crime, her shame, documented and timestamped and pinned to the wall like a butterfly to a board. Dr. Mercer had already started making phone calls. She could feel it in the way the other nurses wouldn't meet her eyes. In the way the attending physician suddenly had urgent business elsewhere when she approached. In the calculated silence that followed her wherever she moved through the hospital. She'd saved a man's life with her hands and her training and her instinct, and Dr. Mercer had turned it into a bullet with her name on it. Within an hour of the sinus rhythm stabilizing on the monitor, Dr. Mercer stepped into the surgeon's lounge and made his first call. The phone pressed against his ear, his voice dropping to that careful octave reserved for people who could hurt him back. The nursing director picked up on the third ring. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "We have an insubordination problem. Float pool nurse, name's Torres. Performed a procedure outside her scope. Post-op decompression. I documented it." Silence on the other end, then the director asking the questions Mercer had already anticipated, already rehearsed his answers for. By the time he hung up, the first domino had fallen. The second call went to hospital administration at 4:19 p.m. Mercer's voice carried the tone of a concerned colleague, a man reluctant to make trouble but bound by duty. "I need to report a patient safety incident. This nurse, she took action without physician authorization. Liability issue. Potentially criminal scope violation. You'll want legal involved." The administrator's voice tightened with every sentence. Mercer knew how those words landed: scope violation, liability, criminal. They turned a save into a problem. They made Rachel Torres into a problem. The third call came at 5:13 p.m., this one routed directly to the state credentialing board. Mercer spoke with the practiced precision of a man filing complaints regularly, a man whose complaints carried weight. "I'm documenting a serious breach. RN performed advanced cardiac intervention without standing orders. Needle decompression, second intercostal space. No physician present. No authorization. He gave dates. He gave times. He gave Rachel's name 3 times so they'd be certain to spell it correctly. When he ended that call, the trap was already closing around her. By 5:51 p.m., HR called her down. Not a request. It wasn't framed as a conversation. The department head, a woman named Patricia who'd never spoken directly to Rachel before, met her in a small office that smelled like stale coffee and the particular kind of institutional silence that precedes terminations. Rachel's badge sat on the desk between them like evidence at a crime scene. Patricia slid a manila folder across the surface. Inside was the written complaint, already printed, already filed, already in the system. Dr. Mercer has documented a scope violation, Patricia said, her words careful and measured, the language of someone reading from a script she'd been given. Emergency needle decompression is not within nursing scope in this state. You don't have standing orders. You performed a surgical intervention without physician authorization. Rachel read the complaint. Every word was technically accurate. Every word was also a lie about what had happened. The patient's oxygen had been at 63%. His lung had been collapsing. His heart rate had been climbing toward the 160s. She'd had maybe 90 seconds before his blood pressure would have bottomed out. But none of that was in the complaint. Just the facts that made her look like an overreaching ego in scrubs. I understand, Rachel said. Your access credentials are being revoked effective immediately. You're relieved of duty pending a formal investigation. You'll need to surrender your badge. Rachel unclipped it from her scrub pocket and set it on the desk beside the folder. The action was precise, deliberate. Her hands didn't shake. They never did, not in front of witnesses. When will I know the timeline? We'll be in touch. You can expect a formal letter within 5 business days. That was it. No appeal process offered. No chance to explain. Just the removal, swift and surgical, the way Mercer had orchestrated it. Rachel stood, nodded once, and left the office. The hallway outside felt longer than it should have, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made people look either guilty or dead. She went back to her locker in the staff room. The other nurses didn't look at her. They never did when someone was being removed. It was like looking at something contagious. Rachel cleared her belongings into a cardboard box, a change of scrubs, a stethoscope with her initials scratched into the diaphragm, a half-empty tube of lip balm, a book she'd been reading for 3 weeks and never finished. At the bottom of the locker, her fingers found the flag. The folded triangle of fabric that had come home from Ramadi in someone's dress uniform, handed to her at a service she wasn't supposed to attend, a memorial for Martinez that existed in classified channels and photos that would never be declassified. She held it for 3 seconds, then placed it carefully into the box. Dr. Mercer appeared as she closed the locker door. He stood in the entrance to the break room, his white coat immaculate, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd solved a problem. You're not to return to this unit without explicit written authorization from administration, he said. Don't make this worse by trying to contact staff members. Rachel turned to face him. Her eyes held his for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to see that his words had landed on her like rain on a stone, leaving no mark. Understood, doctor. You should have stayed in your lane. I did what the patient needed. You did what your ego needed. There's a difference. He paused, letting that land. Get your things and go. She picked up the box. It weighed almost nothing, 5 years of hospital work, reduced to something that fit in one cardboard container. The other nurses watched her leave without saying goodbye. Nobody met her eyes. This was how it worked. You challenged authority, you became invisible. You became someone other people didn't acknowledge, didn't sit with, didn't want contamination from. The parking garage was empty at 6:22 p.m., the lights casting long shadows between the cars. Rachel sat in her sedan in the parking spot she'd claimed 3 months ago, the box beside her on the passenger seat. She didn't drive away yet. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing in particular, the weight of the last 6 hours settling on her shoulders like body armor she couldn't take off. By the time she reached the Waffle House off I-85, the night had fully closed around Atlanta. The place was empty except for a couple in a back booth who barely moved, and a man who'd been nursing the same coffee for what looked like hours. Rachel took a booth by the window. The waitress brought her coffee without asking. It was 3:06 a.m. She'd been driving in circles for over 8 hours. The coffee went cold in the cup. Rachel stared at her reflection in the window, a woman in scrubs with her hair pulled back, exhaustion sitting in the hollows under her eyes like something permanent. She'd blown the mission. That was the real cost of what she'd done in that surgical bay. Not her job. Not her reputation. The classified patient she was supposed to monitor was no longer her responsibility. Her access was severed. The Pentagon's eyes inside Cedar Creek Medical had just been removed, and she'd done it herself by choosing to save a life instead of maintaining cover. She reached into her bag and pulled out Martinez's flag. The triangle of fabric was soft with age, the edges frayed from how many times she'd folded and unfolded it. Martinez had been 23 years old. He'd wanted to go to veterinary school. They'd shared an MRE once in a schoolhouse in Jolin district while rounds of small arms fire punched through the walls, and he'd actually laughed, about how the beef stew tasted like someone had melted a shoe. Now he was a name on a plaque in a classified vault and folded fabric in her bag. She held the flag and thought about Ramadi. She thought about the 13-hour rotation where she performed 7 emergency needle decompressions, for emergency transfusions, and 1 emergency field amputation, and nobody had called it overreach because that was what you did when the alternative was watching someone die. She thought about how a woman who'd done that wasn't supposed to be this uncertain about whether she'd made the right call. The rain started at 3:22 a.m. It came down hard and sudden, the kind of storm that hits without warning, sheets of water hammering the parking lot like applause for something nobody celebrated. Rachel watched it through the window and thought about driving to a motel, but motels wanted cash upfront and she'd checked her wallet, $238. Maybe enough for a few nights, maybe not. More importantly, she didn't have the energy to move. Her body had shut down into that place where exhaustion became something you inhabited, a third country where nothing mattered except the weight of the flag in her hands. She was holding it when something shifted in the corner of her vision. Not in the window. Outside. Beyond the parking lot. The sound came first, faint and distant, the particular percussion that made her spine straighten without permission. A helicopter. Rotors beating the rain-heavy air at a particular cadence that only certain aircraft made. She didn't move. Just listened as the sound grew closer, as the rotor wash began to move the rain sideways, as lights cut through the darkness of the parking lot like something divine was descending. The UH-60M Black Hawk touched down on the asphalt beside the Waffle House at 3:38 a.m., rotors still turning, a figure moving toward the building with a particular kind of urgency that meant everything had just changed. Through the window, Rachel watched the doors to the diner swing open. A man in dress uniform stepped inside, rain sheeting off his shoulders, his eyes scanning the tables until they landed on her. She didn't move. She didn't stand. She held Martinez's flag and watched the Army general walk toward her table like the weather outside didn't matter, like the fact that his son had whispered her code name in the ICU had already set something unstoppable in motion. "Captain Torres," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact. His voice carried the weight of command, the tone of a man who'd spent 40 years getting exactly what he asked for. Rachel placed the flag carefully on the table and looked up at him. "It's time to come home." Rachel's locker door swung shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty nurse station. 3 weeks of belongings, scrubs, compression socks, the laminated badge they'd already deactivated, went into a cardboard box. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects dying in their own light. She didn't look back at the unit where she'd held that tension pneumothorax patient's life in her hands, where she'd done exactly what her training demanded and paid for it with her career. The box weighed almost nothing. That's when the intercom crackled. Code blue. Front entrance. All available personnel respond. Rachel's hands stopped moving. The voice came again, urgent and clinical, collapse at the bus stop. ETA 2 minutes. She set the box down. Every nerve ending in her body went quiet, that specific military stillness that comes from a decade of drilled responses overriding everything else, including judgment calls that had already cost her everything. Her feet were already moving toward the ambulance bay before her brain caught up. The locker room door swung shut behind her. Behind her, the cardboard box sat waiting, its contents forgotten. The bus stop was 3 blocks south on Peachtree, a concrete island surrounded by afternoon traffic and the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with hot asphalt. When Rachel reached the ambulance, the paramedics were already rolling, lights flashing, siren climbing to that howl that made everyone on the street turn their heads. She climbed in without asking, muscle memory operating on a frequency that didn't require permission. A young man, mid-20s, male, was seizing on the pavement when they arrived. Foam at the lips. Eyes rolled back. Limbs thrashing in that terrible coordinated chaos that seizures create. Rachel moved before anyone else had finished assessing. Her hands found his airway with a precision that came from 100 drills in 100 different environments, some of them with rounds passing overhead. She positioned him on his side, cleared his mouth with 2 fingers, monitored his breathing pattern. The seizure lasted 42 seconds. She counted every one. Rachel. The paramedic, a woman named Teresa who'd worked the float pool with her for 3 weeks, stared at her with something close to recognition. Not of Rachel as she was now, but as something else entirely. Something her hands were revealing even though her face remained still. You clear on airway management. Get him on high-flow oxygen. Establish for access. The voice that came out was different. Quieter. Heavier. The voice of someone who'd given orders in circumstances where following them meant the difference between a body bag and a medevac. 12 lead EKG. Full neuro workup. They loaded him into the ambulance. Rachel rode in back, never touching the patient unnecessarily, just watching. Monitoring. Her eyes tracked vital signs like they were battlefield coordinates. The ride took 8 minutes. The young man stabilized halfway through, his eyes fluttering open, unfocused at first, then gradually finding purchase on the real world. That's when his gaze landed on Rachel's face. Recognition flickered across his features, not the recognition of someone who knew her name, but something deeper. Something that lived in the part of the brain that existed before language. He whispered one word. Reaper. Rachel didn't move. Didn't breathe differently. Her hands continued their work. But in that moment, the mission she'd been placed inside Cedar Creek Medical to complete, monitoring a specific high-priority patient while maintaining her cover, suddenly revealed itself as a circle that had just closed. This young man knew what that call sign meant. Which meant his father probably did too. The ICU at Cedar Creek Medical was controlled chaos, monitors beeping their electronic hymn, ventilators wheeling in fresh oxygen, the smell of antiseptic so thick it coated the back of the throat. The young man was stabilized by evening, breathing on his own, the seizure knocked down by benzodiazepines and whatever medical gods watched over people who whispered classified call signs. Rachel stayed in the background, watching from the corners where nurses stood when they weren't needed. Where they could observe without being seen. That's when the father arrived. He was moving before the elevator doors fully opened, a man in his 60s with silver at the temples and a uniform that carried 4 stars on each shoulder. General Marcus Hastings. Rachel knew his file. 73 years old. Ramadi, 2006. 3 Purple Hearts. The kind of man who didn't ask permission, who moved through the world like the air pressure changed around him. His eyes found his son immediately, then moved to the monitors, the 4 lines, the tangle of medical machinery keeping his child in the land of the living. Then his eyes found Rachel. She didn't look away. That would have been worse, acknowledgement disguised as innocence. Instead, she met his gaze with the same neutral expression she'd learned to wear like armor for the past 3 weeks. Nothing. No fear. No recognition. No apology. General Hastings was a man trained to read terrain. He read her face like a map. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration. A moment where his understanding of the room reorganized itself around new data. He stepped closer to his son's bed. The young man's eyes fluttered open, focused on his father's uniform, then moved past him to Rachel's face. The seizure had broken something open in his cognitive architecture. Memory was returning in fractured pieces. His lips moved. Reaper. Again. Louder this time. Certain. Reaper was with Martinez in Ramadi. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, General Hastings reached for the patient's chart. A nurse had left it on the bedside table, Rachel's name printed across the top in clinical black ink. His fingers traced the letters. His face drained of every ounce of the careful neutral expression he'd maintained for a lifetime of military protocols. He pulled out his phone. Made 1 call. Said only 6 words, retrieve her file. Full classification clearance. 20 minutes later, a Marine colonel walked into the ICU wearing dress blues that had never seen a wrinkle and carrying a folder that had been locked in a vault 3 hours ago. His boots hit the tile floor with a precision that echoed. Boot. Step. Another step. For beats. The room noticed. Patients shifted in their beds. Monitors momentarily seemed less urgent. The colonel found Rachel at the medication cart, restocking saline. He opened the folder and began reading aloud, his voice pitched to carry through the hallway, to be heard by anyone within a radius of 40 feet. Captain Rachel Marie Torres. His eyes lifted from the paper to her face. Army Ranger Medic. Assignment, classified. Back to paper. Bronze Star Surveyor in the Hindu Kush. Pause. The room seemed to inhale. Silver Star Surveyor in Ramadi, 2006. Citation: in the face of overwhelming hostile fire, Captain Torres maintained medical composure under another beat. The other nurses had stopped moving. The monitors beeped into the silence and provided field-expedient surgical intervention that saved the lives of 7 personnel under her direct care. He didn't finish reading. He didn't need to. That's when Dr. Mercer rounded the corner, his face already positioned in the architecture of a man about to reclaim his authority. The ICU was his domain. A colonel and a ranger captain and a 4-star general were temporary theater. His theater. I need to clarify something for the record, Mercer said, his voice measured and clinical. Ms. Torres has been terminated for cause. She is no longer employed by Cedar Creek Medical, and her presence here violates hospital policy. Security can escort. The colonel raised his hand. Not aggressively. Not threateningly. Just a gesture that said, stop. General Hastings stepped forward. His right hand moved to his chest, then extended upward in a salute that had been rendered at command ceremonies on 3 continents. Mercer's words died in his throat. His face went the color of old hospital sheets. The salute held for 3 seconds. 4. 5. In that space, something shifted in the geometry of the room. The axis had rotated. He was no longer the center. A woman in a gray suit appeared, Pentagon liaison, Rachel would later learn, though she never caught her actual name. The woman carried a folder identical to the colonel's, plus a second document that bore the seal of the Department of Defense. She walked past Mercer without looking at him. Captain Torres. Formal. Correct. Your mission status has been reassigned. Your clearance is reinstated. These are your updated operational orders. Mercer's face had stopped trying to maintain composure. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand started moving, reaching for his phone, his pager, something to grab onto in the moment when his entire understanding of the hospital's power structure had just been inverted. Your security tape, the CEO said, appearing from the administrative corridor with a look that suggested he'd just swallowed something sharp. We need to review the security footage from the day Ms. Torres was terminated. The hospital's IT director, a man named Marcus Chen who'd served 14 months as a Navy corpsman before transitioning into civilian work, appeared beside Rachel with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Already pulled it, Chen said. His voice had the specific timbre of someone who'd been anticipating sabotage. Saved every frame. Filed a report with the State Medical Board 6 hours ago. He turned to Mercer. Including the footage of you in the server room asking me to delete the original files. Which, you know, is evidence tampering. Possibly criminal. Mercer's hands began to shake. Not the trembling of fear, the trembling of a man watching his entire constructed world collapsing in real time, watching the hierarchy he'd spent decades building invert itself in the space of 90 seconds. His mouth opened. Closed. The sound that emerged was something between a protest and a whimper. I was protecting hospital. You were committing fraud. The Pentagon liaison's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. We have 17 counts of interference with a federal operative. We have documented evidence of obstruction of justice. We have your recorded phone calls attempting to corrupt medical credentialing. She paused. We have Mrs. Linda Martinez on record stating that her deceased husband, combat medic Joshua Martinez, mentioned you specifically, Dr. Mercer, as a physician he did not trust. Apparently he told her, quite specifically, that you cared more about credit than competence. The name landed like a round fired from close range. Joshua Martinez. The medic who hadn't made it out of Ramadi. The name that lived inside Rachel's chest, written on the flag she'd carried in her bag for 8 years. Mercer tried to walk backward. His shoe caught on a monitor cable. He stumbled, caught himself against the ICU wall. His hand left a mark. Desperation has a texture when it meets institutional paint. You have until 0600 tomorrow to surrender your medical license and your hospital credentials, the liaison continued. After that, the FBI will be processing arrests at your residence. What happened in the next 6 hours moved with the specific speed of federal machinery, paperwork processed, violations documented, the hospital suddenly very interested in liability and very uninterested in defending a chief of surgery who'd apparently attempted to cover up evidence tampering by intimidating medical personnel. The CEO called an emergency board meeting. New policies were announced. A trauma wing dedicated to veteran care was approved. Rachel was offered the position of Director of Emergency Medicine. She declined. Instead, 6 months later, she completed her original mission. The patient she'd been monitoring at Cedar Creek Medical was transferred to a Veterans Affairs facility under appropriate military medical oversight, and whatever intelligence he'd been harboring was successfully extracted, and she received her orders for active duty reassignment. She left Atlanta on a clear morning, her dress uniform pressed, her rank pinned correctly to her shoulders for the first time in 9 months. But not before she did one thing. She went back to Cedar Creek Medical on her final morning, walked into the quiet ICU at dawn, and found the locker that had been held for her. Inside was the cardboard box, untouched. She opened it. The folded flag was there, the one given to her at Martinez's service, the one she'd carried through Ramadi and through humiliation and through the moment when saving a life had cost her everything. She unfolded it, took it back to her new office in the Rangers Command Center, and hung it on the wall where she could see it every single day. Not hidden. Not apologetic. Unfolded. And when the nurses she'd worked with at Cedar Creek Medical saw the news, Captain Rachel Torres, promoted to Major, reassigned to Special Operations Command, Director of Combat Medical Training, they understood. The quiet temp nurse who'd been bullied by their chief of surgery had been something else entirely. Meanwhile, Dr. Mercer was found 3 weeks later living in a studio apartment in Tucson, driving a medical supply van for a rural urgent care clinic. His name tag read, Steve. He flinched every time a customer called him doctor. He never used that title again. The nurses at his former hospital heard about it eventually. They never spoke his name without a specific kind of silence that followed, the silence of people who'd watched the wrong person and learned exactly how wrong power can go. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Hit that like button now. And I need to know, would you have revealed your identity, or stayed invisible? Drop your answer below. Subscribe so you never miss a story.